This episode of Nutshell Brainery is brought to you by The Courage to Succeed, Discover and Achieve What Matters Most, and Tell Everything Else to Take a Hike by Lon Schiffbauer. Now available at Amazon.
Hi there, I'm Lon Schiffbauer. Today we're going to wrap up our discussion of the fundamentals of communication by talking about content, tone, and messaging. I know, it's taken us 8 episodes to get this far, but by this time you've probably figured out why. All too often when we talk about communication, all we're really discussing is what we want to say and how we're going to say it. In other words, the content and tone of our message. But as we now know, this depends to a large degree on the channel we use to communicate, and the right channel depends on who we're trying to communicate with. And we won't know who we need to communicate with until we know why we're communicating in the first place. So you see, there's really no point in talking about content, tone, and message until we've covered all our bases first. And that's what we did in our first 7 episodes. And over these 7 episodes, we've climbed that mountain, crossed that sea, and plumbed those depths. So now we're ready. So let's talk about content, tone, and message. Let's start with content. Think of content as the means by which we communicate our message in a given channel. If a channel is a box, then the content is what goes in the box, the contents of the box. A book's content is the written word. A podcast's content is the spoken word. A video's content is the spoken word, facial expressions, the background, even the theme music. Now, yes, back in episode 5, I said that things like words and facial expressions were channels in and of themselves. But in this case, they function as a means of imbuing larger channels with meaning. After all, a book without words isn't really much of a book, at least not one that's going to be optioned for a screenplay. Likewise, a video without me in it is, well, probably a pretty darn good video, but you get my point. And remember, as we discussed in episode 6, the more channel attributes you bring together, the richer your channel will be, and therefore more effective at communicating your message. Okay, so that's content. But content does not exist without tone. Content and tone are inextricably linked. Tone is the general sense or character conveyed through our content. Now, when it comes to explaining what establishes tone in the content, it's almost easier to talk about what doesn't establish tone. Tone permeates everything. We establish tone in the very words that we use and the way that we deliver them. When we speak, we set the tone by the intonation in our voice, our facial expressions, our volume. All these things help to imbue these words with meaning beyond the simple definition of the word. And when it comes to conveying emotion and feeling, tone actually is much more powerful than the words themselves. For example, let's say that you ask someone how their weekend was, and through a shower of tears and a quivering lip, they told you they had a great weekend. They did some shopping, took in a show, slept in, fantastic. Would you just leave it at that and move on? Or would you be like, dude, what's wrong? In this case, the expressions and the quivering lip communicated far more than the words that said, things were great and fantastic. Tone can even be established in written media. Things like the font that you choose or the color. All these things establish tone. Imagine getting a birthday card that looked like this. What would that tell you? Well, granted, a couple of my friends would really dig this. I'm looking at you, Felicia. Still, you see what I'm saying. Tone can come through in the most subtle ways that we don't always think about. All right, so content and tone work in tandem to help deliver a message. So now it's time to think about how are we going to craft our message. Now please, don't just wave this off as a perfunctory step. This entire communication process we've been discussing culminates in the delivery of the message. So it stands to reason that we should really think about how we're going to craft what we want to communicate. Now, in crafting our message, we really need to bear 3 things in mind. What do we want our audience to know, feel, and do? To some degree or another, every message informs, educates, evokes a feeling, and inspires somebody to action. So let's start with that educating or informing. That is the know part of know, feel, and do. This is the information that we want our audience to understand when exposed to our message. After all, they're not going to take any action on our message unless they understand those fundamental things they need to know in order to feel comfortable moving forward. This, of course, brings us to the feel part of the equation. What are the emotions we want them to feel when exposed to our message? A well-crafted message evokes an emotional response, something that inspires them to say, yeah, I feel like this is the right thing. After all, our goal is to influence the attitudes, behaviors, and actions of others, and that's not going to work if they do not feel like this is the right thing for them. Which then brings us to do. In other words, what do we want our audience to do when they receive our message? If our goal is to affect or influence behavior, what behavior specifically are we talking about? Think of it this way. If we are observing them doing what we want them to do, what are they doing? Okay, so now if content and tone come together to help us craft our message, a message that educates, evokes a feeling, and inspires action, then the question becomes, what constitutes a good message? One that actually inspires this action we're seeking to bring about. The answer to this is a message that speaks to the needs and hopes and desires of the audience. Remember back in episode 3 when we talked about understanding our audience, really getting into their demographics, psychographics, and context of their environment? It's at this point that research pays off. For us to communicate effectively, we have to frame our message in a way that matters to our audience. In communications, we call this WIFM. What's in it for me? Every time somebody is exposed to a communication, they ask themselves, why should I do what you're asking me to do? What's in it for me? Now, this is harder than it sounds. After all, we're pretty selfish creatures. Most of the time when we communicate, we're thinking about what's in it for us. What do I want to get out of this dialogue? And if we approach it like that, it's not a dialogue, it's a monologue. Not good. And ultimately, people really don't care that much about what's in it for you. They care about what's in it for them. This isn't selfishness. They have limited time, energy, resources. They need to really make sure that they're using those resources properly. So if you don't have a message that matters to them, they're going to move on. Next, a good message is one that our audience can easily understand and act upon. This means using the right words and phraseology and having a clear call to action. So with this in mind, let's first look at words and phraseology. We want to use words, grammar, and terminology that our audience understands and is comfortable with. For example, my wife works in the medical field, and she'll talk all day about, Gracie, something like that. I meant to ask her how that was pronounced. Odontoid and axiolateral hip or Daniel Miller. I don't know. It's all Latin to me. But if she's having a discussion with doctors or other medical professionals, then there's solid communication going on. But if she's just talking to me, it's deer in the headlights. So in the evening when she tells me about her day, she needs to kind of dumb down the language so that I can understand and relate to her job. By the way, business people love this sort of elaborate and ritualistic language. Terms like leverage and buy-in and synergize, they permeate every boardroom and cubicle you can imagine. We'll talk about that more in a future episode, but trust me, it's an epidemic. The point is, you need to use words and phrases that have meaning to your audience and don't alienate them or build up an artificial barrier between you and the folks that you're trying to influence. So that brings us to the call to action. Wait, isn't call to action jargon? In a call to action, you're inviting your audience to do what you're hoping they will do upon receiving your message. Sometimes the call to action is explicitly stated, like, subscribe to my YouTube channel. But this isn't always the case. A comedian doesn't just walk out on the stage and say, Please laugh at my jokes. I wonder if that could work in a bit. Now, the point of a call to action is to facilitate the desired outcome of your communication. So obviously, this means you need to first understand why are you communicating. Now, this might sound, duh, hey George, obvious, but you'd be surprised. Have you ever listened to somebody talk and thought to yourself, so why are you telling me this? In cases like this, the person themselves may not even know why they're telling you this. The call to action or the desired outcome is not clear in their head. So to avoid this, we need to make sure that each time we communicate, it's pretty clear to ourselves at least what it is that we're trying to affect. And so there we are. Now we have a better understanding of how content and tone come together to help us craft a message that speaks to the needs of our audience. And with that, we've covered all the fundamentals of communication, or at least as much as we can do in an hour and a half. After all we've really managed to cover are the first few snowflakes on the tip of the iceberg. But you know what? It's a start. As this series continues, we'll cover things like interpersonal communications, business communications, things like that. So I hope you'll stick with me on this journey. It should be a lot of fun. In the meantime, I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching.